In late 19th century London, gas lamps flickered through thick industrial fog, and silent crowds moved along cobblestone streets. Among them lived Mary Pearcey, a woman of uncertain origins and shifting identities, whose life would eventually intersect with one of Victorian England's most haunting and bewildering murder cases forever. Welcome to Darkest Files. Thank you for joining us tonight. Share in the comments where you are listening from, and consider subscribing to explore more forgotten histories with us together. The final decades of the 19th century in London were defined by contradictions that shaped both public life and private destinies. The city was expanding rapidly, fueled by industrial growth, swelling populations, and new railway connections that drew migrants from rural towns into the heart of the empire. Streets once lined with modest cottages now stood shoulder to shoulder with shops, public houses, textile warehouses, and narrow blocks of rented rooms. Social mobility remained limited, however, and while the wealthy displayed their status in refined neighborhoods and private carriages, countless others lived in cramped lodgings where meals were shared and privacy was scarce. This was the London into which Mary Pearcey emerged, although her early origins were never fully documented, leaving her past partly obscured by uncertainty. Historical accounts suggest she was born around 1866 under the surname Wheeler, though records contain gaps, aliases, and conflicting statements. A life beginning without clear documentation often indicated poverty, fractured families, or early displacement, all common among women with limited social support in Victorian Britain. As Mary entered adulthood, her presence in official records remained ambiguous. She moved through neighborhoods in the north of London, residing in modest housing where rent was paid weekly and occupants frequently changed. Women like Mary often relied on informal employment to survive, performing domestic labor, household service, sewing, or work in small local shops. In these environments, relationships formed quickly and dissolved just as easily, shaped less by long-standing community ties and more by proximity and necessity. Social reformers of the era described such districts as transient micro-communities, where residents shared space in close quarters but often knew little about one another's pasts. This setting allowed Mary to reinvent her identity, adopting new associations and presenting herself in different ways, depending on her circumstances. Victorian society imposed rigid expectations upon women regarding propriety, loyalty, and moral conduct. Marriage and maternal roles were considered the defining markers of respectable womanhood, while economic dependence on men was widely accepted. Women who remained unmarried faced harsh scrutiny, particularly if they maintained relationships outside formal unions. Against this backdrop, Mary's life stands out as a departure from conventional norms. She was known to live with men without marriage, moving between relationships and navigating social boundaries that polite society regarded with suspicion. Such behavior alone did not predict criminality, but it placed Mary outside the protective structure of traditional expectations, leaving her more vulnerable to isolation, instability, and judgment. Despite her unconventional path, Mary created a circle of acquaintances within her residential districts, including men who admired her and women who regarded her with caution. One of the individuals who would become central to her later story was a man named Frank Hogg, a railway worker from Finchley. Historical accounts indicate that Frank was involved with another woman, Phoebe Hogg, who would eventually bear his child. Yet he also maintained a close relationship with Mary, visiting her frequently and sharing companionship that extended beyond casual association. In neighborhoods where space was limited and domestic routines easily observed, relationships like these were rarely private. Neighbors saw who came and went, who shared meals, and who argued behind thin walls. Rumors circulated through common stairwells and around market stalls, even when few spoke openly. Mary's emotional investment in Frank appeared intense, though records do not reveal how their relationship began or how much was mutually understood. What is clear from surviving testimony is that their connection deepened over time, continuing even after Frank formalized his domestic life with Phoebe. While Victorian men were often afforded social flexibility in personal conduct, women who pursued relationships with committed men risked moral condemnation and public scorn. Mary, already living independently and outside traditional norms, carried that burden alone, with few allies to defend her choices. Daily life in these districts followed practical routines, shaped by limited income. Mary occupied rented rooms furnished sparsely, often with only a stove, small table, and bed. Meals consisted of tea, bread, preserved meat, and occasional produce. Heating fuel was precious and often rationed. Laundry hung across small courtyards and alleyways, while local children played near water pumps or collected coal from railway yards. Despite the hardship, evenings brought a semblance of peace as lamps were lit and residents returned from long work hours. Mary was seen walking these streets, at times solitary, at other times hosting visitors. Nothing at this stage of her life signaled the violent chapter to come. Instead, she appeared as one among thousands of working women navigating survival in a city indifferent to their struggles. Yet small details from witnesses hint at early instability beneath the surface. Accounts mention moments of tense conversation with male companions, sudden changes in residence, and emotional outbursts observed by neighbors who later recalled them with greater significance. These recollections must be considered cautiously. Memory often bends under the weight of later events, shaping harmless moments into ominous signs. Still, they form part of the environment in which Mary lived, revealing how relational tensions could deepen when financial dependency, romantic aspiration, and social isolation converged. By the late 1880s, Mary's connection to Frank and his growing family became increasingly complicated. Phoebe, as the mother of Frank's child, represented stability and domestic legitimacy. Mary, meanwhile, represented a different kind of life, one marked by emotional volatility and uncertain future. Whether Mary felt rivalry, abandonment, or obsession cannot be confirmed through documented evidence. What can be stated is that the interactions among these three individuals formed a fragile triangle shaped by Victorian expectations of loyalty and the harsh realities of economic survival. As autumn approached in 1890, Mary continued living in Kentish Town, maintaining daily routines that offered outward normalcy. She shopped at local markets, prepared meals, washed linens, and tended to household tasks. But below the surface, unspoken tensions gathered weight. The precise factors that would push the story toward violence remained hidden, forming quietly like pressure without release. On certain evenings, neighbors observed Mary walking alone under dim street lamps, her footsteps measured and steady. There was no reason then to assume those walks signaled anything more than contemplation or fatigue. Yet in later recollections, these images returned to witnesses with a haunting clarity, suggesting that Mary may have been turning over thoughts she never spoke aloud. The final detail that leads us into the next chapter is simple. Mary's growing proximity to the Hoggs did not diminish. It deepened. It became more frequent, and it moved steadily toward a point from which none of the three would return unchanged. Mary's deepening proximity to the Hogg family unfolded gradually, shaped not by sudden confrontations, but by small, persistent interactions that blended into the daily rhythm of Kentish Town. In the late Victorian era, this district sat just north of central London, transitioning from rural fields into dense residential streets lined with modest terraced houses and small shops offering bread, coal, and household necessities. Though not among the city's poorest districts, Kentish Town housed clerks, laborers, widows, and skilled tradesmen, all living close enough to observe one another's routines. Within this environment, reputation mattered, and word of mouth often functioned as both social currency and judgment. Mary lived here for several years, renting rooms on College Street, where residents later remembered her not as a withdrawn figure, but as a woman who maintained a certain presence, one who kept her space tidy and dressed neatly despite limited means. Her home was typical for the time, a small set of rooms heated by a stove, furnished with worn but functional items, including a table, a sideboard, linens neatly folded, and a pram stored indoors for lack of space. Visitors would have noticed the cramped quarters and the faint smell of coal dust mixed with cooking. Privacy in such dwellings was minimal. Doors were thin, walls carried sound, and neighbors regularly overheard conversations, quarrels, and footsteps long after dark. For Mary, this setting provided both a refuge and a stage on which her relationships unfolded, visible to those who shared the building. Frank Hogg's visits to Mary became a familiar sight to neighbors. He was not wealthy, but he held steady work on the railways, a profession respected among working-class men seeking stability. His involvement with both Mary and Phoebe created an unusual social dynamic, though such arrangements were not entirely unheard of in districts where marriage was often delayed by poverty. Phoebe, living separately but connected to Frank through motherhood and domestic expectation, occupied a more socially accepted position. She represented the conventional path: partnership, household management, and family responsibility. Mary, by contrast, represented emotional attachment outside formal boundaries, and though she may have hoped for a deeper commitment, evidence suggests Frank maintained both relationships without fully severing ties to either woman. The distinctions between these two women extended beyond their relationships to Frank. Accounts describe Phoebe as gentle, reserved, and domestic, her life largely structured around her child and home duties. Mary, meanwhile, was described as lively, assertive, and prone to moods that shifted quickly. In another era, such traits might have been praised as independence or strength, but in Victorian society, women who displayed emotional intensity or personal ambition were often met with suspicion. These differences would later feature prominently in public narratives about the case, where newspapers constructed contrasting portraits of the innocent mother and the jealous mistress. It is difficult to know how much of this division reflected reality and how much was shaped by moral expectations. Still, the contrast formed part of the environment that framed Mary's actions and the public's response. Economic pressures weighed heavily on all three individuals. Rent, food, coal, and clothing consumed most income, and illness or unemployment could bring sudden crisis. Women with children but without legal marital status often faced additional vulnerability, relying on informal arrangements for support. Though historical records do not indicate direct hostility between Mary and Phoebe prior to the crime, it is clear that their lives intersected through Frank in ways that could not remain sustainable indefinitely. Whether tension manifested openly or simmered beneath surface civility remains uncertain, but observers later recalled signs of strain, such as hushed conversations and fleeting expressions of distress. Mary's emotional investment appeared to intensify during this period. She cooked meals for Frank, walked with him through nearby streets, and kept items in her rooms that suggested a deeper connection, such as personal belongings he stored there. Social norms of the period discouraged unmarried cohabitation, yet Mary's choices reflected a willingness to defy convention. When Frank spent increasing time with Phoebe and their child, neighbors noticed changes in Mary's demeanor. Some described her as withdrawn, others as visibly upset. Again, these recollections must be weighed cautiously. Memory after a tragedy often seeks earlier signs of collapse, but they suggest Mary was not unaffected by the shifting balance of affection and attention. Daily life continued around her. Stalls opened at dawn, factory whistles sounded at midday, and railway engines echoed through the district. Children played close to the roadside, women carried baskets from markets, and men gathered in public houses on Saturday evenings. Within this ordinary environment, Mary carried out her routines while harboring thoughts that would soon alter the course of multiple lives. The tension was not abrupt. It built quietly, shaped by emotional entanglement, societal expectations, and private longing. As weeks passed, Mary remained connected to Frank despite his deepening ties to Phoebe. Some neighbors recalled seeing Mary with a pram during this time, though no infant lived in her rooms. Others mentioned stains on clothing that Mary explained as accidental. None of these details carried meaning at the time, but they would later be examined meticulously by investigators seeking to reconstruct events leading to the murder. Objects that once served domestic purposes would eventually be scrutinized as possible instruments of violence. Yet at this stage, they remained ordinary components of home life, unnoticed by those who passed through her building. The streets of Kentish Town, though bustling, could be quiet after nightfall. Gas lamps left long stretches of road in partial shadow, and footsteps echoed clearly against cobblestone. Residents often walked alone, returning from work or errands, their paths crossing without conversation. Mary was among these night wanderers, her presence observed but not questioned. Whatever thoughts occupied her mind remained unspoken, held in silence as she walked beneath lamps that flickered in the wind. One detail stands out as we move closer to the moment of crisis. Despite ongoing shifts in Frank's domestic life, Mary maintained direct contact with him, and increasingly, with Phoebe. Their interactions grew more frequent rather than fading away. This overlap of relationships, intimate yet unstable, became part of the daily landscape in Kentish Town, known to neighbors yet never addressed openly. And so, as autumn progressed, the relationships that bound Mary, Frank, and Phoebe moved toward a point of irreversible consequence, one shaped not by a single event, but by a gradual tightening of emotional and social threads. The path ahead would lead from domestic tension to a crime that shocked London and lingered in history long after the individuals themselves were gone. As the evenings grew colder and leaves gathered along the edges of the streets, a single question loomed quietly over their lives. How long could this fragile balance continue before breaking? How long this fragile balance could continue remained unknown to those living their everyday lives in Kentish Town, but the answer would begin taking shape in subtle changes observed during the months leading to the crime. The emotional triangle among Mary, Frank, and Phoebe gradually shifted from uneasy coexistence to quiet strain. These were not dramatic confrontations witnessed publicly, but ordinary, almost mundane interactions that took on new meaning only in hindsight. At the time, they appeared to be everyday movements of people navigating work, relationships, and responsibilities. Yet beneath the surface, emotional weight accumulated, shaping decisions that would soon have irreversible consequences. Frank continued dividing his time between the two households. To outsiders, his movements might have appeared simply practical, a man supporting his partner and child while maintaining social ties elsewhere. But within the personal lives of the women involved, these visits carried emotional implications. Phoebe relied on Frank not only for material support, but for the stability that Victorian society expected from a respectable family structure. Mary, however, had lived independently and built a relationship with Frank before Phoebe's presence solidified. She may have viewed his ongoing connection to her as evidence of continued affection or commitment, even as his obligations to Phoebe deepened. During this period, neighbors recalled seeing Mary more frequently in thoughtful or distant moods. She walked with a purposeful stride through the narrow streets of Kentish Town, her hands clasped behind her back or resting firmly at her sides. She passed rows of boarding houses, gas-lit shop windows, and small yards enclosed by low fences. At times she returned home carrying parcels wrapped in brown paper or baskets from the market. These observations were typical of working women of the era, yet when investigators later interviewed witnesses, they treated such movements as potential indicators of planning and motive. Whether these reflections misinterpreted normal behavior or revealed subtle shifts in Mary's mindset is impossible to determine with certainty. Still, they illustrate the way ordinary actions can take on lasting significance after tragedy unfolds. Phoebe, caring for her young child, lived a quieter domestic life and engaged with her social circle primarily through neighbors, markets, and church. Her responsibilities left little time for wider engagement. Family structures like hers represented the expected norm for women of the era, and communities often extended sympathy toward mothers perceived as vulnerable or reliant on male support. While Phoebe likely knew of Frank's ongoing visits to Mary, historical records do not clarify the extent of her awareness or emotional response. It is possible she tolerated the arrangement to preserve stability for her child. It is equally possible she felt private distress. Victorian society discouraged women from expressing such feelings openly, particularly when they risked appearing confrontational. Meanwhile, Mary continued maintaining her household with careful attention to appearances. Visitors noted that her rooms were tidy, with linens folded and furnishings arranged neatly. She kept a pram indoors, an object that would later become a central symbol in the case. At the time, it may have simply served practical purposes, as many working women assisted friends or neighbors by transporting children or goods. Yet when investigators discovered its use in connection to the crime, its presence transformed into evidence. This shift from domestic tool to incriminating object marked one of the many ways ordinary household items became pivotal in reconstructing events. Mary's psychological state during this time remains largely speculative, recorded only through external observation, but the era itself placed women like her in vulnerable positions. Without legal ties, financial security, or social support, emotional relationships could take on heightened meaning. The risk of abandonment carried not only personal pain but practical consequences, threatening housing, income, and reputation. For a woman already navigating independence against social norms, the possibility of losing Frank could have represented more than romantic disappointment. It may have signaled the unraveling of a fragile stability she worked to maintain. The emotional divide widened further when Frank spent longer periods with Phoebe, particularly as their child grew and domestic obligations increased. Neighbors recalled Mary reacting to such changes with visible tension, sometimes appearing stern or withdrawn. One witness later claimed to have seen Mary handling household objects with forceful energy, though this recollection surfaced only after news of the crime, making it difficult to assess objectively. Still, these memories illustrate how communities retroactively seek signs of violence in gestures that once seemed innocuous. The broader social environment also contributed to pressure. London was undergoing rapid transformation, with new railways increasing mobility and expanding both opportunity and displacement. Families who could not keep pace with rising costs faced relocation or overcrowding. Women lived with constant awareness that their security depended heavily on relationships and reputation. For those already living without traditional marital structures, circumstances could shift rapidly and without support. Mary lived within this precarious framework where the boundaries between emotional distress and social survival blurred. As autumn deepened, a pattern emerged in Mary's daily activities. Witnesses recalled seeing her leave her residence earlier in the day, returning with folded cloths or cleaning supplies. She visited markets and small shops more frequently, sometimes purchasing items that seemed unrelated to routine cooking or maintenance. These details alone did not indicate intent. Households required ongoing upkeep and preparation. Yet in retrospect, such activities fed theories that Mary was preparing not simply for domestic life, but for a decisive act tied to her emotional circumstances. Frank's presence remained inconsistent but continued. People in the neighborhood recognized him by sight, observing his movements without openly commenting. His shifting allegiances between two women would later form the basis of motive presented in court, framed as jealousy and revenge. Whether this interpretation accurately reflects Mary's internal state or simplifies complex emotional dynamics into a moral narrative remains unresolved. What is certain is that the ongoing intersection of these three individuals' lives created a pressure that grew silently, shaped by expectation, dependency, and unspoken conflict. On certain nights, Mary was seen walking alone under dim street lamps, her silhouette outlined by the glow of nearby windows. The pram appeared again during this period, pushed along uneven cobblestones or positioned outside her doorway. Without context, such moments appeared ordinary. They were part of the daily choreography of life in Kentish Town. But when investigators pieced together timelines, the pram became a central clue, connecting movement, motive, and opportunity. This period marked a shift from emotional buildup to behavioral change, not through dramatic scenes, but through subtle modifications in routine. Mary's relationship with Frank did not dissipate. Instead, it intensified through acts of quiet resolve. Whatever she contemplated, she did so privately, without confiding in neighbors or acquaintances. Her silence concealed the emerging direction of events, leaving those around her unaware of the approaching tragedy. And as the nights lengthened and the air chilled, the stage upon which these private tensions unfolded moved closer to a defining moment. The relationships that once formed a fragile triangle would soon transform into a single, irreversible line of action, beginning with a day of unusual movements that witnesses later recounted with stark clarity. That day was approaching. And when it finally arrived, it did not begin with grand events or noticeable disruptions. Instead, it began, like countless others, in late Victorian London, with ordinary routines unfolding beneath a gray autumn sky. The morning hours in Kentish Town carried familiar sounds, market carts rattling over cobblestones, children calling to each other near shop fronts, and the distant hum of railway traffic. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, Mary Pearcey moved through her tasks with a sense of purpose that later witnesses described as unusually focused. These observations only emerged after investigators questioned residents, but they were recalled with enough consistency to indicate that Mary's actions on this particular day differed from the quiet regularity of her past behavior. From early afternoon onward, Mary was seen making multiple trips in and out of her rooms. Neighbors remembered the sound of her door opening and closing, footsteps moving quickly rather than at her usual measured pace. She arranged household items, shifted furniture slightly, and removed cloths and towels that she carried outside for cleaning. None of these actions appeared alarming at the time. They reflected domestic maintenance common among working women. Yet those same cloths, once returned indoors, later bore marks that investigators linked to the violence that would soon follow. At the time, however, they seemed mundane and unremarkable. One object drew particular attention that day: the perambulator stored in Mary's residence. Previously seen only occasionally, the pram was now positioned prominently near her doorway. Some neighbors noted that Mary moved it in and out of the house, as though preparing it for use. In the social landscape of Victorian England, prams typically signaled maternal care or childcare assistance among neighbors. Women often borrowed such items from one another, using them to transport infants, food, or goods across districts. When investigators later traced the pram's movements, they found it had played a central role in transporting not a child, but a body. On this day, however, it remained simply another domestic object, its significance invisible to those who walked past. In the hours leading up to dusk, Mary's activities grew more focused. Witnesses recalled seeing her clean kitchen implements and set them aside in deliberate arrangements. Crockery, basins, and utensils were washed and dried with precision. The sound of scrubbing and the movement of water echoed faintly against the walls of the narrow home. Victorian households often required extensive cleaning due to coal dust and limited sanitation, so these actions appeared logical. Only later did forensic examinations suggest that preparations on this day were not solely for hygiene, but for concealment after the act that would soon unfold. As daylight faded, Mary left her residence, walking with steady steps along the familiar streets. The sky darkened quickly, and gas lamps flickered in uneven intervals, leaving patches of road in near darkness. The wind carried the faint scent of coal fires burning in nearby homes. Witnesses reported seeing Mary walk with an air of determination, though none could identify her destination. She passed loosely gathered groups of workers returning home and women carrying bundles of laundry. Her clothing was typical for the season, layered garments to guard against the cold and a coat pulled close around her shoulders. Many years later, such details would be repeated in court to establish her timeline, yet at the moment, they were simply part of the unnoticed flow of city life. What happened next remains partly reconstructed from evidence rather than observed directly. Historical records indicate that Mary made contact with Phoebe Hogg and her child later that evening. The invitation or arrangement that brought them together is unknown, and no witnesses heard their interaction. Phoebe left her home carrying her infant, expecting to complete a brief visit before returning. She walked through quiet residential lanes, unaware that she would not return alive. The routes women walked at dusk in Victorian London were shaped by safety concerns, avoiding alleyways and poorly lit areas. Phoebe likely believed she was traveling toward a familiar place, with someone she knew. During this time, Mary was later seen returning toward her residence with the pram. Neighbors recalled hearing wheels along the pavement and seeing her moving with exertion, though they could not see what lay inside. They noticed her posture was tense, her arms pushing firmly, and her clothing appeared disordered, as though from physical strain. None asked questions. People in London's working districts learned not to pry unless circumstances demanded it. The sight of a pram rolling through the streets did not raise concern. It was only later, when investigators pieced together the timeline, that the pram's journey became a pivotal element of the case. Blood traces found inside the carriage, faint yet undeniable, suggested that the pram had carried Phoebe's body after she was killed. The tight space of the pram meant that the child, still alive when separated from its mother, could not remain with her. The infant was later found abandoned separately, a detail that profoundly disturbed Londoners when newspapers reported it. Yet in this moment, as Mary pushed the carriage through the night, witnesses observed only movement, not meaning. When Mary returned to her residence after transporting the body, neighbors recalled hearing unusual sounds from within her rooms. There were muffled movements, the shifting of heavy objects, and the unmistakable sound of scrubbing. These noises continued for a prolonged period and differed from typical nightly routines. One resident noted that her door remained closed, though faint light from inside flickered beneath the threshold. When later questioned, neighbors expressed regret that they had not knocked or inquired further. At the time, however, such sounds could have reflected cleaning after a long day or preparing for visitors. Hours later, Mary was seen again walking outside, this time without the pram. Her movements were slower, her posture more composed, and she paused near street corners as though composing herself. The night had grown colder, and the lamps cast elongated shadows along the pavement. People crossing her path took little notice. Her face appeared calm, not distressed. The strength of her composure after committing violence would later be described in court as unsettling, though she offered no explanation during these final hours before discovery. Meanwhile, the body of Phoebe Hogg lay abandoned in a quiet lane in Hampstead, discovered by passers-by who initially mistook the form for a discarded bundle. The child, found later in a separate location, still breathed faintly when located, though exposure left lasting harm. The scene was chaotic and unprepared for. Police arrived with urgency, lanterns illuminating the cobblestones and surrounding foliage. Officers marked the area, collected items found nearby, and attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events. The brutality of the injuries raised immediate alarm. Local residents gathered at a distance, whispering among themselves, unsure how such violence had entered their neighborhood. At this early stage, investigators did not yet know where to focus suspicion, but items collected at the scene soon revealed a connection to Mary, linking domestic objects to public tragedy. The body, once found, initiated a chain of inquiry that would lead directly back to the small rooms on College Street. And while the night grew silent again, one disturbing truth emerged. The violence had already occurred, but its meaning had not yet come to light. That revelation would begin in the hours that followed, as the police traced a trail of objects back toward Mary's door. But their first task began not with suspicion, but with the grim responsibility of documenting what lay before them. The discovery of Phoebe Hogg's body in Hampstead late that evening sent a stirring wave through the district. At first, the scene appeared chaotic, shaped more by confusion than by order. Passers-by gathered in clusters, keeping distance yet unable to turn away, their eyes fixed on the still figure resting unnaturally on the ground. The dim light from handheld lamps and nearby gas posts illuminated the body only partially, casting deep shadows across the pavement. Officers who arrived described the scene with professional restraint, noting the position of limbs, the condition of clothing, and visible injuries. These observations form the earliest official record of the crime. The location itself offered insight into how events unfolded. Hampstead, though near Kentish Town, differed in character. It was quieter, less densely populated, and lined with open spaces and long stretches of road that remained largely deserted after dusk. It lacked the constant foot traffic found closer to the city center. A body left there could easily go unnoticed for hours. The carriage lamps of passing vehicles occasionally illuminated patches of road, but the area rested mostly in silence. The decision to leave Phoebe's body in such a place suggested deliberation. It was neither hidden nor ceremoniously placed, but abandoned where discovery would occur eventually rather than immediately. This detail later influenced the prosecution's argument that the act was both brutal and calculated. The state of Phoebe's body caused immediate alarm among investigators. The injuries were severe, indicating physical struggle and direct assault. Blood had soaked portions of her clothing and pooled onto the ground beneath her. The violence suggested a personal attack rather than random street crime. Robbery could be ruled out early. Her personal effects, though disordered, were not stripped from her. Her child was missing, leading to fears that the infant had also been killed. The absence of the baby intensified the urgency of the search, turning the area into an expanding perimeter of lantern light and hurried footsteps. Meanwhile, residents and authorities began spreading word of the discovery. Constables were dispatched to question those who lived nearby, while others fanned outward along Hampstead's roads in search of the missing infant. It was during this widening search that the child was eventually found, abandoned separately, exposed to the cold night air. The infant's condition reflected prolonged exposure rather than direct physical harm, suggesting that the child had been removed from the scene rather than attacked at the same location. This separation of mother and child became one of the most disturbing elements of the case, deeply affecting Londoners when newspapers reported the incident in detail. The press soon arrived, armed with notebooks and urgency. Victorian journalism thrived on sensational stories, particularly those involving women, children, and violent crime. Though the full facts were not yet known, reporters collected statements from shaken witnesses and crafted headlines that captured public attention. These early articles, printed before formal evidence emerged, helped shape the narrative long before police completed their investigation. Citizens across London awoke the next morning to stark headlines describing a mother found murdered and a child left helpless. Public reaction was swift, driven by both compassion and an instinctive desire to assign blame. The police, working through the night, gathered physical evidence from the scene, including fabric scraps, traces of blood, and impressions on the ground that indicated movement prior to discovery. The body was transported with care, placed under supervision, and prepared for examination. Early assessments pointed to blunt force trauma, likely inflicted with a household object rather than a weapon typically associated with street assaults. This detail narrowed the scope of inquiry. The nature of the injuries indicated proximity, familiarity, and direct physical engagement. The attack did not appear opportunistic. It suggested emotional stakes. Meanwhile, attention turned to identifying the victim. Once Phoebe Hogg was officially named, investigators traced her final known movements. They contacted those close to her, including neighbors and acquaintances, creating a timeline of her departure from home with the child. When questioned, some recalled she had left expecting a brief visit, though none could specify with whom. The ambiguity surrounding her final appointment raised early suspicion that the assailant was someone she knew personally. This line of inquiry soon intersected with known associations, including Frank Hogg and, by extension, Mary Pearcey. Investigators did not immediately target Mary as a suspect. Instead, they approached the case methodically, mapping social relationships and regular contacts. But the more they asked questions, the more her name appeared, not merely as a distant acquaintance, but as a central figure in Phoebe's domestic orbit. When neighbors confirmed that Mary had been deeply connected to Frank and that emotional tensions may have surrounded the relationships, police began considering her more closely. As investigators gathered information from Hampstead, another team followed leads back into Kentish Town. They traced objects found at the scene, noting similarities to common household items. Eventually, items appeared to resemble those known to exist in Mary's residence. These connections were not yet definitive, but they formed threads that pointed toward the modest home on College Street. Officers prepared to visit her lodging, not to accuse, but to question, to observe her demeanor, her space, and any possible inconsistencies. Before they arrived, however, the building itself seemed to offer a silent testimony. Residents recalled disturbances from Mary's room the night before, sounds of scrubbing, shifting furniture, and prolonged cleaning. Again, no one intervened. Such noises, though unusual, were easily dismissed as late-night chores. It was only after the body's discovery that neighbors connected these sounds to the crime. Their recollections grew precise under interrogation, shaped by both fear and retrospective clarity. By the time police completed their initial site analysis in Hampstead and returned to Kentish Town, the pieces of the case began forming a recognizable shape. The brutality of the murder, the abandonment of the child, the use of household objects, and the potential emotional motive all pointed toward a target of inquiry that was no longer diffuse. Officers prepared to enter Mary's rooms not merely as investigators, but as observers seeking evidence that might confirm their growing suspicions. Yet before taking formal action, they paused to gather additional testimony. They sought to understand the relationships involved before making a public accusation. The police, bound by procedural caution, needed more than conjecture. They required tangible proof. And so they prepared to examine Mary's home in careful detail, searching for stains, objects, or traces that could connect domestic life to criminal violence. The public, meanwhile, remained unaware of who might be responsible. Rumors circulated, names were whispered, and speculations filled taverns and street corners. But the police had not yet acted. Their next step would determine not only the direction of the investigation, but the future of the woman now at the center of quiet suspicion. As the night faded into morning, a single unresolved question carried through police reports and witness interviews. If the crime began in a domestic setting, what would investigators find when they finally stepped across the threshold of Mary Pearcey's home? When police finally stepped across the threshold of Mary Pearcey's home, they entered not a chaotic scene, but a carefully arranged domestic space that appeared, at first glance, to be in respectable order. Victorian investigators were trained to look for visible signs of struggle, forced entry, or objects disturbed in haste. None of these were present. The furniture stood neatly against the walls, linens were folded, and household tools rested in designated places. To an untrained observer, the room might have seemed entirely ordinary, yet the officers noticed subtler signs that hinted at recent activity. The faint scent of recently dried cloth, a lingering dampness in certain areas of the floor, and the presence of cleaning supplies left in positions that suggested hurried use. Nothing appeared overtly incriminating, but the timing of the discovery raised suspicion. One of the most telling observations involved the stove and surrounding surfaces. Investigators noted that certain items displayed unusual discoloration, as though heated or scoured repeatedly within a compressed period of time. The hearth, a common centerpiece of domestic life, appeared recently cleaned beyond normal household standards. Victorian homes often accumulated soot and residue quickly, and cleaning only specific sections of a stove rather than the entire hearth could indicate an attempt to remove substance rather than simply maintain cleanliness. Though subtle, these details reinforce the sense that recent intensive cleaning had been conducted with purpose. Beyond the stove, officers examined the floors and walls. The wooden planks bore faint marks that might have been overlooked under ordinary circumstances. Some areas appeared scrubbed with particular vigor, leaving surfaces slightly lighter than adjoining sections. Investigators could not yet determine whether these patches were connected to the crime, but they registered the irregularity. No pools of blood remained, but damp fibers on rags and towels hinted at stains washed away. Given the limited forensic tools available at the time, the police relied heavily on visual assessment and physical texture rather than chemical analysis. Even so, the evidence suggested that violence could have occurred there, and that efforts had been made to remove traces. Attention soon turned to personal belongings. On tables and sideboards, officers discovered ordinary items: cutlery, basins, small cloths, and containers used for food preparation or general domestic tasks. These objects were not unusual, yet their arrangement suggested they had been moved recently. A closer look revealed faint discolorations that appeared dried and residual. Investigators collected these items, recognizing their potential significance. The assumption was not that they proved guilt, but that their presence and condition warranted further scrutiny. One object drew particular attention: the pram. Now positioned indoors, it appeared clean, yet not uniformly so. Officers inspecting the frame and interior noted irregular patches where fabric had been scrubbed unevenly. The wheels bore traces of material that resembled dirt from outdoor roads, consistent with recent movement. The pram's presence alone did not implicate Mary, but it provided a direct physical link to the transport of objects or persons. In the days ahead, forensic examination, limited though it was, would reveal blood traces inside, connecting the pram not to child transport, but to the movement of Phoebe's body. As the search continued, investigators questioned neighbors about unusual events from the previous night. The accounts they provided varied in detail but aligned in tone. Several recalled hearing prolonged cleaning sounds, water filling basins, scrubbing against wood, and the shifting of heavy objects. Others mentioned glimpsing Mary leaving or returning at late hours. These recollections, once mundane, now appeared suspicious under the weight of discovery. Still, police approached these accounts carefully. Memory could be influenced by fear or rumor. They recorded statements meticulously, creating a timeline that placed Mary inside her home during the approximate time of the murder. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, the police did not immediately arrest her. They understood the importance of thorough documentation before making a formal accusation, especially in a case involving emotional motives and intertwined relationships. Instead, they continued gathering details about Mary's connection to Phoebe and Frank. Interviews with acquaintances and residents confirmed that Mary and Frank had maintained close ties, and that Phoebe's presence posed a complication in their relationship. The officers recognized a potential motive, though they refrained from declaring it conclusively. The broader investigation extended beyond physical evidence. Authorities reviewed letters, informal accounts, and patterns of movement among the three individuals. They sought to determine whether Mary had lured Phoebe to her home or whether the encounter occurred spontaneously. Letters exchanged between Mary and Frank, though not openly incriminating, suggested emotional frustration and attachment. Such correspondence helped investigators craft a narrative that connected motive to opportunity. Meanwhile, the public waited for answers. Newspapers published updates daily, tracing the investigation's progress with dramatic headlines. The brutality of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim stirred widespread outrage. Reports emphasized the cruelty inflicted upon a mother and the abandonment of her child, fueling speculation about the nature of the perpetrator. Many readers assumed the killer must be male, driven by violent temperament or predatory instincts. When hints emerged that a woman might be involved, the reaction shifted sharply. Female criminality, particularly violent acts against other women, defied prevailing expectations of gender and moral conduct. The idea that a woman could commit such an act unsettled readers, shaping the emerging narrative that surrounded Mary long before her trial. As days passed, investigators' confidence in Mary as a suspect strengthened. They assembled physical objects that connected her to the crime, documented witness testimony that placed her in proximity to both victims, and recorded inconsistencies in her activities the night of the murder. Most significantly, the pram linked domestic space to the location where Phoebe's body was found. This evidence became the central anchor of the case. The decision to bring Mary to the station for questioning reflected not only growing suspicion, but procedural necessity. Authorities needed to examine her account formally, compare her statements to the established timeline, and assess her reaction when confronted with evidence. When officers approached her, she reportedly appeared composed and cooperative, acknowledging their presence without outward distress. Her calm demeanor was noted in official records, though at that point no formal charges had been made. Such composure would later be interpreted by some as evidence of cold calculation and by others simply as composure under pressure. Her statements did little to dispel suspicion. She offered explanations for cleaning activities, but could not fully account for the condition of certain objects. She denied involvement in the crime and maintained her innocence. Some of her responses appeared vague, potentially due to stress or intentional discretion. Investigators noted discrepancies between her account and witness testimony. While they did not arrest her immediately, they continued gathering corroboration. As questioning extended into the following days, police officers weighed their findings carefully. They understood that the case required not only motive and suspicion, but demonstrable physical evidence linking Mary to the crime. That evidence was growing steadily, piece by piece, forming a chain that investigators believed could withstand scrutiny in court. By the close of this investigative phase, the police had moved beyond cautious inquiry and toward decisive action. The next step would shift the case from suspicion to formal accusation. They prepared to present their findings, secure warrants, and move forward with an arrest that would capture national attention. The quiet household where officers first found faint traces of violence was no longer a place of speculation. It had become the center of a criminal investigation that would reshape the lives of everyone connected to it. And now that investigators believed they understood where the murder occurred, their focus turned to proving how and why it happened. Now that investigators believed they understood where the murder occurred, their focus turned to proving how and why it happened. The threshold of Mary Pearcey's residence became a focal point not just for searching objects, but for interpreting behavior, intention, and method. The investigative method of the late 19th century relied heavily on physical observation, testimony, and logical inference, rather than the modern forensic science that would emerge decades later. Police officers understood that the evidence collected from Mary's lodging could not stand alone. It needed to be paired with a narrative that explained the sequence of events. Without this narrative, even compelling objects risked being dismissed as coincidence. The officers returned to her residence for a more thorough examination, this time with clearer purpose and a growing sense of certainty. The room that had seemed merely tidy now appeared curated to erase traces of a violent encounter. Investigators took measurements of walls and floors, noting areas where sharp scrubbing left marks that differed in texture from the surrounding wood. They found small fragments of fabric, fibers lodged in crevices, and stains on the underside of furniture that suggested attempts to clean surfaces without fully disassembling them. These irregularities did not independently prove guilt, but they aligned with the hypothesis that a body had been handled there. One of the most significant discoveries involved a knife and several household tools stored inconspicuously near the stove. At first glance, these were ordinary domestic implements, typical of a Victorian home where preparation and cleaning required multi-purpose utensils rather than specialized devices. Yet certain tools bore scratches and residues inconsistent with routine food preparation or maintenance. Officers collected them carefully, recognizing that even small inconsistencies could later support a timeline of violent struggle. Though chemical blood identification techniques of the era were limited, dried residues could still be compared visually to stains on clothing or fabrics recovered from the scene in Hampstead. Attention soon shifted from objects to spatial reconstruction. The police tried to determine how a struggle might have unfolded within the confined space. The modest size of Mary's room suggested proximity and physical contact. The limited area around the hearth would have constrained movement, forcing the assailant to act quickly and decisively. Investigators speculated that the pram, positioned nearby, could have served as a receptacle for the body shortly after the attack. Such reconstruction was not performed with modern forensic precision, but it provided a narrative framework that officers believed could be supported through evidence. As evidence mounted, the investigation expanded outward to gather supporting testimony. Neighbors were questioned again, this time with more targeted inquiries. They reported hearing sounds that indicated heavy lifting, objects dragged across the floor, and water being poured repeatedly into basins. Some mentioned detecting the faint metallic smell associated with blood, though such claims may have been shaped by hindsight. Under Victorian lighting and sanitation conditions, many homes carried diverse odors, making precise recollections difficult. Still, when several residents reported similar impressions, investigators took their observations seriously. At this stage, Mary's own actions became a subject of scrutiny. Officers reviewed her movements in the days following the crime. She continued carrying out tasks in measured silence, showing neither panic nor withdrawal. She walked streets with her usual cadence, purchased goods from local shops, and engaged in ordinary domestic upkeep. Her ability to maintain outward composure drew both fascination and condemnation. For some observers, such calm suggested a disciplined attempt to conceal guilt. For others, it reflected a personality accustomed to self-possession, particularly in circumstances where societal expectations forced women to mask emotional turmoil. These differing interpretations would later shape arguments in court and public opinion alike. The police concluded that a formal confrontation was necessary. They prepared to bring Mary in for extended questioning to compare her statements rigorously against established evidence. When officers approached her again, they found her at home, engaged in routine activity. She appeared neither surprised nor distressed by their arrival, responding to their presence with composed acknowledgement. Her willingness to cooperate did not diminish suspicion. Rather, it highlighted the contrast between her demeanor and the gravity of the evidence collected. At the station, investigators questioned her closely about the timing of her movements, the cleaning that took place, and the use of the pram. She offered explanations that, while not explicitly incriminating, conflicted with witness testimony. She claimed that her cleaning had been ordinary household labor, not an effort to erase evidence. She acknowledged that the pram had been moved, but denied transporting anything unusual. She did not falter or contradict herself dramatically, yet her answers lacked specific detail where investigators expected clarity. These gaps became red flags, raising questions about her credibility. Meanwhile, police compared physical items from her home with objects found near the crime scene. Scraps of fabric matched materials in Mary's possession. Fibers recovered from the pram appeared consistent with clothing Phoebe had worn. Even without advanced laboratory tools, investigators identified similarities through texture, weave, and precision of cut. The most compelling evidence emerged when objects found near the body matched household items known to have been owned by Mary before the night of the murder. These connections formed a chain of reasoning strong enough to support more direct action. As suspicion solidified, officers presented their findings to superiors, who agreed that probable cause existed to move toward arrest. The decision was not taken lightly. Public attention had intensified, and the idea of arresting a woman for such a violent act represented a significant break from societal assumptions. The authorities prepared for a case that would undoubtedly attract national scrutiny. When they returned to Mary's residence for the final time, they carried not sheets of inquiry but documentation that authorized them to detain her formally. Mary did not resist when officers informed her of their intent. Witnesses later described her expression as steady and impassive. She followed instructions and accompanied the officers without outward distress. Some observers interpreted her composure as evidence of guilt. Others viewed it as the stoicism expected from women who, lacking social power, learned to endure accusation without visible protest. In either case, her arrest marked a transition in the investigation. No longer a subject of suspicion, she had become the central figure in a criminal case. News of the arrest spread quickly. Papers printed special editions, reporting that a woman had been detained for the Hampstead murder. Headlines emphasized the shocking nature of the accusation, focusing on the unprecedented spectacle of a female suspect charged with a brutal killing. Reports often framed the crime through moral and social lenses rather than legal analysis, reinforcing narratives about jealousy, revenge, and emotional instability. These portrayals shaped public perception long before Mary appeared in court. Inside police custody, the atmosphere shifted from inquiry to preparation. Officers documented her physical condition, the clothing she wore at the time of arrest, and any marks or injuries that might relate to the struggle. They cataloged objects seized from her lodging and stored them as evidence. The case had entered a new phase, one defined not by speculation, but by formal legal proceedings. The quiet rooms of her residence, once the center of domestic life, now stood abandoned, their contents sealed for examination. Their role in the narrative had shifted from home to crime scene. And as Mary remained under custody, awaiting the next steps of the process, the investigation turned from collecting evidence to presenting it. The stage was now set not merely for accusation, but for trial. Yet before the case could proceed to the courtroom, investigators needed to fortify their conclusions with evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny. The late 19th century was a transitional period in criminal investigation. Scientific methods were not yet refined, but interest in forensic inquiry was growing. Courts still relied heavily on witness testimony, motive, and circumstantial connections, but physical evidence was gaining prominence as a means of establishing facts independent of human interpretation. In the case of Mary Pearcey, investigators turned to the available tools of Victorian forensic examination, hoping to transform observations into proof. One of the first areas of focus was blood evidence. At this time, identifying blood as distinctly human was still beyond the capability of forensic science. The earliest tests capable of distinguishing animal from human blood would not be developed until the following century. Instead, investigators relied on visual assessment, textile analysis, and consistency of staining to determine whether certain marks could indicate violent injury. When officers compared cloths, garments, and household items from Mary's residence with those recovered near the body, they noted similarities in color, texture, and pattern of absorption. These assessments lacked the precision of modern testing, yet they established that the blood-like stains in Mary's home were recent, concentrated, and inconsistent with accidental injury or routine cooking. The pram, which had already emerged as a central piece of evidence, underwent further scrutiny. Investigators examined the interior lining and frame, identifying residues that matched stains found on Phoebe's clothing. Though definitive biochemical confirmation was impossible, the alignment of patterns suggested direct contact. The pram's wheels, too, revealed traces of soil consistent with the Hampstead location where the body was left. Officers retraced the suspected route, noting distinctive ground textures that matched residues found along the wheel rims. These subtle details strengthened the theory that the pram transported the body from Mary's residence to the site of discovery. Tools found near the stove also became objects of examination. Investigators noted scratches and worn surfaces on items that might have been used as blunt instruments. The shape of certain tools corresponded roughly with the type of injuries described on Phoebe's body. These connections were interpretive rather than conclusive. The implements did not bear identifiable fingerprints, nor did they carry definitive stains that could be chemically tested. Yet, in a legal context where physical correlation supported narrative reasoning, the objects strengthened the prosecution's emerging argument that the murder occurred indoors and involved direct force. In addition to physical evidence, the police considered behavioral indicators. They analyzed Mary's cleaning efforts not simply as domestic chores, but as post-crime concealment. The nature of the scrubbing, intense, targeted, and irregular, suggested removal of specific stains rather than routine maintenance. Investigators noted that certain areas of flooring were cleaned more thoroughly than others, and the timing of these activities coincided with the disappearance of Phoebe and the discovery of her body. Such patterns contributed to the argument that Mary acted deliberately to obscure evidence. While the physical case strengthened, the investigators continued gathering testimonial support. They interviewed neighbors once more, this time focusing on corroborating elements rather than broad impressions. Residents described hearing unusual noises during the critical time period, seeing Mary push the pram under conditions that suggested exertion, and observing her perform late-night cleaning. Others mentioned seeing her discard cloths or objects soon after the crime. Each account added small pieces to a larger sequence of events. The testimonies varied, as human recollection often does, but their collective weight reinforced the narrative of a violent act occurring indoors, followed by an attempt to transport and conceal the body. Investigators also studied the relational dynamics that linked Mary to Phoebe and Frank. By Victorian standards, emotional motive carried significant weight. The law operated under assumptions that crimes often stemmed from passion, jealousy, or moral transgression. Mary's position as an unmarried woman involved with a man who belonged to another domestic arrangement framed her not as an outsider, but as a catalyst of emotional conflict. The press emphasized this angle, portraying her as a figure driven by jealousy. Whether such interpretations reflected truth or reinforced societal bias remains uncertain. What is clear is that the relationship provided prosecutors with a motive readily understood by juries of the time. As evidence continued to accumulate, police began preparing the formal charge. Their decision reflected a shift from investigation to legal strategy. They needed not only to assert that Mary might have committed the crime, but that no alternative explanation sufficiently aligned with the evidence. The possibility of another assailant remained open theoretically, but practically, the convergence of physical objects, movement patterns, emotional ties, and behavioral inconsistencies narrowed the case to a single suspect. Mary remained composed throughout this phase, maintaining her innocence and offering limited explanation. She did not provide alternative suspects or definitive accounts that might redirect the investigation. Her silence, whether strategic or born of resignation, left police with no competing theories to consider. The absence of a counter-narrative further solidified their stance. With the evidence consolidated, authorities prepared public statements and submitted formal documentation. The news that Mary Pearcey would face trial for the murder of Phoebe Hogg drew immediate national attention. Newspapers intensified their coverage, publishing serialized accounts of the investigation. Public interest grew, driven not only by the violence of the act, but by the perceived incongruity of a woman accused of such brutality. Crowds gathered outside police stations, waiting for updates. Illustrated papers printed sketches of Mary, often emphasizing expressions that conveyed sternness or emotional detachment. In private, legal officials finalized the case structure. They reviewed the physical objects seized, sorted witness statements, and constructed a timeline that positioned the crime within a coherent framework. Their goal was not only to establish guilt, but to demonstrate intent. Prosecutors believed they could argue that Mary had lured Phoebe to her residence, killed her, and transported her body to a remote location, separating her from the child to facilitate concealment. By the time the case reached readiness, Mary's role had shifted firmly from suspect to defendant. She would be transported under guard to begin the formal judicial process. The environment that awaited her differed sharply from the small rooms of her residence. The courtroom stood as a public stage of scrutiny, where evidence, reputation, and narrative converged under the authority of law. As Mary departed custody for the first stages of trial preparation, the modest dwelling where she had been found remained sealed. Its interior, once defined by routine domestic life, now existed only as evidence, preserved for examination and presentation before the court. The investigation had reached its end. The legal process was about to begin, and with that shift, the focus now moved from the scene of the crime to the forum where society judged guilt. The focus now moved from the scene of the crime to the forum where society judged guilt. Mary Pearcey's arrest marked a turning point not only in the investigation, but in public perception. While she awaited trial, the machinery of Victorian criminal justice began to mobilize around her case. This process unfolded in stages, beginning with her transfer into formal custody, where she would remain under supervision until her day in court. The transition from private interrogation to public legal scrutiny signified a shift from fact-finding to accountability, and with it came an extraordinary degree of public attention. As authorities prepared Mary for detention, they conducted standard procedures required for prisoners accused of serious crimes. These included documenting her physical appearance, noting any marks that might indicate struggle, and assigning her to quarters where she could be observed closely. Prison conditions in the late 19th century were austere and heavily regulated. Cells were small, minimally furnished, and governed by strict schedules intended to maintain discipline. Prisoners awaiting trial were treated differently from those already convicted, but the environment remained isolating. The stone walls, narrow windows, and limited communication reinforced the gravity of her circumstances. Mary's demeanor throughout this process remained calm and controlled. Officials noted her quiet composure, recording that she did not exhibit emotional outbursts or pleas for sympathy. Her lack of visible distress drew speculation, particularly among those predisposed to associate guilt with emotional detachment. Others interpreted her silence as dignity under accusation or a protective withdrawal from public scrutiny. Whatever the psychological explanation, her restraint became a defining aspect of how observers remembered her. Outside the prison, the public response intensified. Newspapers issued daily coverage, often emphasizing sensational elements of the case. Lines formed outside printing houses as citizens sought updates. The press published illustrations of Phoebe Hogg, dramatized retellings of the crime, and speculative accounts that painted Mary as calculating and remorseless. Some publications framed her as a cold-hearted figure, driven by jealousy. Others portrayed her as a mysterious woman with a secret past. The absence of clear biographical records contributed to these narratives, allowing journalists to fill gaps with conjecture. This conflation of fact and speculation shaped public opinion long before the trial began. Victorian society reacted strongly to the notion of a female perpetrator committing violent murder. Cultural norms associated women with nurturing roles, moral restraint, and domestic responsibility. Crimes involving maternal victims and domestic implements challenged these assumptions deeply. Women accused of violent acts were often judged not only on legal grounds, but on perceived betrayal of gender expectations. Mary's case, involving both a mother and a child, magnified this tension. The public struggled to reconcile the brutality of the crime with prevailing cultural ideals of womanhood. Consequently, Mary became a subject not simply of legal examination, but of moral discourse. As the public debated her character, legal authorities continued preparing the case. Prosecutors compiled evidence, organized witness lists, and worked to construct a cohesive argument linking Mary to motive, method, and outcome. They reviewed statements that placed her at the center of a complex emotional relationship and correlated them with physical evidence from her home. They prepared to argue that she acted with deliberate intention rather than in a moment of spontaneous violence. Such deliberation, they believed, distinguished murder from lesser offenses and justified severe punishment. The defense, meanwhile, faced the challenge of countering a narrative that appeared increasingly cohesive. Without a clear alternative suspect or explanation for the evidence, they focused on questioning the reliability of physical connections. They noted that stains could not be scientifically confirmed as human blood, that witnesses might misremember events, and that circumstantial evidence could not replace direct proof. Their strategy emphasized uncertainty rather than constructing a competing account. This approach reflected the limitations of the era. Without forensic testing or a definitive timeline, they could only challenge the strength of inferences rather than overturn them completely. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Mary remained largely isolated from the public, emerging only in controlled settings. She was transported under guard to preliminary hearings and legal consultations. Each movement attracted crowds, who gathered along streets to catch a glimpse of her carriage. Some observers watched silently, others whispered among themselves. Reports described mixed reactions: curiosity, condemnation, and, in rare cases, expressions of sympathy. The spectacle of a woman accused of such a crime drew attention not merely because of its severity, but because it disrupted societal narratives surrounding gender and violence. Throughout this period, Mary's behavior remained consistent. She answered questions when required, maintained composure before officials, and refrained from public declarations. She neither confessed nor attempted to justify herself. Silence became her defining public posture. For some, this lent her an aura of calculated resolve. For others, it suggested resignation. The path toward formal trial narrowed as preparations concluded. Evidence was cataloged, legal strategies solidified, and the public waited in anticipation. The courtroom would soon become the place where interpretation and reasoning collided with the structured rituals of justice. Yet before proceedings could commence, authorities finalized arrangements for Mary's transfer to the court, ensuring security and establishing the presence of officials, press, and observers. When the day arrived for her first formal appearance before the assembled court, the streets surrounding the building filled early. People gathered not merely to witness a legal proceeding, but to observe history as a woman stood accused of a crime defined by violence, secrecy, and betrayal. The courtroom itself, constructed to impose formality and solemnity, symbolized societal authority. Its high ceilings, polished rails, and ordered seating emphasized the weight of the moment. Mary entered under escort, taking her place before the court. Her presence was described in measured terms by those who attended. She appeared calm, neatly dressed, and attentive. There were no outward displays of fear or confrontation. Her expression remained poised, reflecting the same restraint noted since her arrest. This composure became a subject of commentary in the following day's papers, which struggled to interpret a demeanor that offered no clear emotional cues. As the proceedings opened, officials read the charges against her. The language was formal and direct, outlining the accusation that she had murdered Phoebe Hogg and abandoned the infant in a separate location. The courtroom fell silent as the charges echoed through the chamber, establishing the legal foundation upon which testimony and evidence would later build. Preliminary statements concluded, the court adjourned to prepare for the full trial, which would unfold in the days beyond. The public dispersed slowly, carrying with them impressions of the defendant that would shape how they interpreted the evidence still to come. The legal process had officially begun. The next stage would reveal how the court analyzed the evidence gathered over weeks of investigation and how Mary's composed silence would fare under the weight of formal accusations. The trial awaited, and with it came the formal machinery of Victorian justice, a structured sequence of legal procedures designed to transform suspicion into judgment. Before the full proceedings began, Mary Pearcey entered a transitional phase of pre-trial preparation, where legal representatives, court officers, and government authorities moved in parallel to finalize the case. This period served as a bridge between investigation and courtroom examination, ensuring that each piece of evidence was cataloged correctly, each witness identified, and each legal claim supported by documents that followed protocol. The pretrial process did not capture public attention in the dramatic way that the murder itself had, yet it provided the essential framework that would shape how the court heard and interpreted the case. During this time, Mary remained in custody, where her daily life was governed by routine. She rose at fixed hours, followed regulated schedules of meals and confinement, and received limited communication from the outside world. Officials monitored her closely, documenting her behavior with the same precision used during investigation. Reports described her continued composure and quiet reserve. She neither requested special treatment nor displayed outward signs of agitation. Her controlled demeanor remained consistent, reinforcing the image already formed during arrest and interrogation. To those observing her, this restraint appeared deliberate, though they could not determine whether it reflected confidence, resignation, or emotional detachment. Meanwhile, prosecutors refined their strategy. They reviewed evidence collected from Mary's residence, cross-referenced it with findings from the crime scene in Hampstead, and constructed a clear timeline. Their objective was to demonstrate not only that Mary was physically linked to the crime, but that she possessed motive and acted in a manner consistent with premeditation. The case relied on three key pillars: physical evidence connecting her to the body, witness testimony placing her at critical locations, and the emotional context involving Frank and Phoebe. Each element carried weight independently, but together they formed a narrative the prosecution believed would withstand legal scrutiny. Much of the pre-trial work involved organizing objects into evidentiary categories. Household tools suspected of inflicting injury were cataloged and labeled. Cloths and garments bearing stains were packaged for presentation. Items recovered from the crime scene were matched to domestic objects from Mary's rooms. Even the pram was entered into evidence, described not simply as a vehicle, but as a container, central to the movement of the body. The prosecution planned to use these objects not only as physical exhibits, but as symbols of domestic life transformed into instruments of violence. Witness coordination also took place during this phase. Officers arranged statements chronologically, identifying individuals whose testimonies could establish key moments in the timeline. Neighbors who heard late-night activity would describe sounds consistent with cleaning and movement. Those who saw Mary pushing the pram under suspicious conditions would recount their observations. Others who interacted with the victim earlier in the day would testify to her expected destination. No single testimony could conclusively define the crime, but together they formed an interlocking structure of evidence. While prosecutors built their case, the defense faced a more challenging task. They lacked alternative suspects, contradictory evidence, or a counter-narrative supported by documentation. Their strategy, therefore, focused on undermining the prosecution's interpretation rather than proposing another version of events. They emphasized the limitations of forensic analysis, noting that stains could not be identified conclusively as human blood. They questioned witness reliability, pointing out that recollections made after the crime might be influenced by fear or suggestion. They argued that household objects could bear marks from ordinary use rather than violence. Their approach relied on introducing doubt rather than establishing certainty, a common strategy in cases where physical evidence carried more interpretive than scientific weight. Mary's interactions with her legal representation remained largely formal. She provided information when necessary but did not attempt to reshape the narrative publicly. She did not request opportunities to speak beyond required consultation, nor did she offer emotional statements that might sway perception. Her reserved behavior continued to define her public persona, leaving others to interpret her inner state through speculation rather than direct expression. As the pre-trial period progressed, interest surrounding the case continued to grow. Newspapers published updates on procedural developments, often embellishing details to sustain public engagement. Articles described Mary's composure, her appearance in court during early hearings, and her silence under questioning. Some accounts framed her as calculating, others suggested she possessed an unsettling calm. The press used her demeanor to construct narrative archetypes: the cold killer, the fallen woman, the unrepentant figure. Such portrayals, while not evidence, influenced how audiences anticipated the trial itself. Court officials prepared the physical space for proceedings, ensuring accommodations for press, witnesses, legal teams, and public spectators who inevitably crowded into the gallery. The courtroom was arranged with precision, exhibits cataloged for presentation, transcripts prepared, and schedules established. The trial promised to be lengthy, as each piece of evidence required methodical examination. Judges and clerks reviewed procedural rules to maintain order and fairness, recognizing that public scrutiny elevated the responsibility to adhere strictly to legal standards. As the first day of trial approached, Mary was transported from custody under careful supervision. The journey, though short, represented a symbolic passage from confinement to judgment. Streets along the route filled with onlookers, drawn not merely by curiosity, but by the desire to witness a moment marked by historical weight. Women accused of violent crimes were rare in Victorian England, and such cases drew attention comparable to major political and social events. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was solemn. Officials and spectators took their places, surrounded by walls designed to convey authority and restraint. Wooden benches held rows of observers. Polished rails separated the public from legal proceedings. The weight of the case could be felt in the quiet, which fell over the room as Mary entered. She took her place, seated with measured posture, hands still, gaze forward. Her expression mirrored that of earlier encounters, composed, neither defiant nor distressed. Legal formalities began, with the judge outlining the structure of the trial and affirming expectations of order. Prosecutors prepared to present opening statements, though not in this first administrative session. The court focused initially on procedural matters, confirming charges, verifying legal representation, and ensuring all exhibits had been formally submitted. These steps may have appeared routine, but they formed the foundation upon which the trial would rest. Without them, the arguments that followed risked collapse. Once these formalities concluded, the court adjourned again, setting the stage for the full presentation of arguments and evidence. Mary was escorted out, her steps steady, accompanied by officers who maintained professional distance. Observers watched her exit before turning their attention to the anticipation of what would unfold in subsequent sessions. The transition was now complete. Mary had moved from investigation to accusation, from arrest to formal trial preparation. The next phase would bring the full weight of legal argument, witness testimony, and forensic scrutiny to bear on the case that had captivated public attention. Inside the courtroom, the air settled into a tense stillness, carrying the expectation of testimony soon to be heard. The trial would now begin in earnest. When proceedings formally opened, the courtroom transformed from a chamber of procedural formality into a stage where evidence, testimony, and interpretation converged under public scrutiny. The case drew large crowds, filling benches with citizens from varied backgrounds, tradesmen, clerks, widows, and members of the Victorian middle class, all eager to observe a trial defined not only by violence, but by the rare spectacle of a woman accused of murder. Outside the courthouse, people gathered in clusters, waiting for updates from journalists who rapidly transcribed statements for publication. The courtroom's doors closed once seating reached capacity, leaving many outside to rely upon word-of-mouth reports. Inside, the space exuded solemnity. High ceilings absorbed murmurs, while polished wood reflected the glow of natural light filtered through tall windows. The judge presided from an elevated position, symbolizing the authority of law, while clerks managed documents with organized precision. Jurors entered quietly, chosen for their perceived impartiality, though none could fully escape the influence of the extensive press coverage that preceded the trial. Their task was to evaluate evidence presented within the courtroom, separate from the narratives forming beyond its walls. Mary Pearcey sat among her legal counsel, composed and attentive. Observers noted that she maintained the same restrained posture seen during earlier proceedings, hands folded, gaze forward, showing neither dramatic tension nor outward distress. Her reserved expression left her intentions unreadable, offering no clues to those who sought insight into her emotional state. Some interpreted her poise as stoicism. Others viewed it as a sign of calculated indifference. Whatever the interpretation, her demeanor continued shaping the public perception of her character throughout the trial. The prosecution opened by outlining the structure of its case. Their approach relied on presenting the narrative in chronological order. The relationships that formed the emotional backdrop, the events of the day of the crime, the discovery of the bodies, and the physical evidence linking Mary to the act. Their tone was measured, avoiding embellishment, but the facts themselves carried inherent gravity. They described how Phoebe left her home that day with her child, expecting to complete a simple visit, and how she never returned. They detailed the discovery of her body in Hampstead and the separate location where the infant was found, emphasizing the disturbing dual nature of abandonment and violence. As the prosecution progressed, they began introducing evidence gathered from Mary's residence. Household items collected from her rooms were displayed in the courtroom, each one labeled, cataloged, and placed before the jury. The pram, perhaps the most symbolic object of the case, was presented first. Its appearance in the courtroom carried significant weight, its physical presence evoking the contrast between domestic caretaking and the brutal event it was accused of concealing. The prosecution described how traces found within the pram's interior matched stains observed on Phoebe's clothing and how the soil embedded in its wheels corresponded to the terrain of the discovery site. Though the forensic methods of the time could not provide chemical confirmation, the physical correlations were strong enough to imply direct involvement. Next came testimony regarding the state of Mary's lodging. Officers described the irregular cleaning patterns observed on floors, walls, and household cloths. They spoke of the scrubbed surfaces, the lingering dampness, and the concentrated areas of cleaning inconsistent with routine maintenance. These observations provided a foundation for the argument that the crime occurred indoors and that Mary attempted to remove evidence afterward. The prosecution did not rely on dramatic rhetoric. Instead, they allowed the accumulation of details to build a picture of deliberate concealment. Witnesses from Kentish Town were then called to describe what they observed on the night of the murder. Residents recalled hearing the sounds of water filling basins, objects shifting across the floor, and persistent scrubbing that continued well into the late evening. Others testified to seeing Mary push the pram at an hour when such activity seemed unusual. Some noted her posture and expression, describing an exertion inconsistent with childcare. Though individual testimonies varied in detail, their collective effect strengthened the prosecution's timeline, suggesting a sequence of events that aligned with physical evidence. Throughout the presentation, Mary remained steady, listening without visible reaction. Observers watched her closely, searching for signs of remorse, fear, or indignation. She offered no such signals, her stillness creating a contrast with the emotional intensity of the evidence being described. This posture, whether intentional or instinctive, became central to the narrative forming around her. For some, her calm demeanor under scrutiny suggested guilt. For others, it reflected an inability or unwillingness to perform emotional responses expected by the public. As the prosecution continued, they introduced letters and records related to Mary's relationship with Frank. These documents were not presented as definitive proof of motive, but as context supporting the emotional tensions surrounding the case. Victorian courts placed significant weight on motive as a means of constructing legal narrative. The letters, though not explicitly incriminating, illustrated that Mary and Frank shared a relationship characterized by emotional intimacy and complexity. The prosecution used these documents to argue that jealousy, frustration, or betrayal might have contributed to the decision to commit violence. The courtroom listened in concentrated silence, absorbing each piece of evidence as it layered upon the previous one. The prosecution emphasized that the crime was not random, but personal, rooted in close connections among the individuals involved. They argued that the brutality of the attack reflected emotional intensity and proximity, rather than opportunistic violence. By the time the prosecution concluded its opening presentations, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted. The initial curiosity that accompanied the trial's beginning transformed into a sober recognition of the weight of evidence. Spectators no longer viewed the case merely as a sensational spectacle. They observed a narrative supported by objects, testimonies, and documented relationships. Jurors prepared to hear further witness accounts and forensic interpretation, aware that future proceedings would deepen rather than resolve the case immediately. As court adjourned for the day, Mary was escorted out under guard, walking with the same measured steps that had characterized her movements since arrest. Crowds outside waited to see her, though she did not acknowledge them. She entered transport and returned to custody, leaving behind a courtroom that would soon hear the next phase of evidence. The trial had begun, but its outcome remained uncertain. The next days would bring deeper examinations of forensic details and personal testimonies, drawing the court closer to its eventual conclusion. The proceedings were far from over. And as the trial resumed, the court shifted its attention from introductory evidence to deeper analytical testimony. This phase required greater precision, as the prosecution sought not merely to present objects and observations, but to explain how each detail contributed to a coherent reconstruction of events. The courtroom atmosphere grew more focused, with jurors leaning forward as experts, police officials, and community witnesses took their places. What had begun as a narrative rooted in circumstantial connections now evolved into a structured attempt to demonstrate, step by step, how the crime unfolded and why investigators concluded that Mary Pearcey had been responsible. The prosecution began this stage by returning to the pram, which stood as a central link between domestic space and the scene of discovery. Officials described its condition again, but with greater depth, detailing the locations of stains, abrasions on the wheels, and faint fibers embedded inside the lining. These fibers were compared against samples from Phoebe's clothing, which displayed similarities in weave and texture. Although Victorian forensic science could not confirm exact matches through microscopic comparison, as later methods would, the alignment was persuasive. The prosecution emphasized that the pram was not merely a passive object, but a vehicle of concealment that connected two geographic locations in a way that ordinary domestic use could not explain. Attention then shifted to the floorboards and walls of Mary's residence. Officials presenting this portion of evidence described the irregular distribution of cleaning marks, noting that certain areas exhibited far greater wear than others. The size and placement of these patches suggested that blood or bodily fluids might have been present there. The judge instructed jurors to consider the evidence objectively, without assuming conclusions that scientific tools could not confirm. Still, the pattern implied targeted removal rather than broad, routine cleaning. The prosecution used these observations to support their claim that the violence occurred indoors and that Mary attempted to obscure its traces soon afterward. Next, the trial examined the nature of Phoebe's wounds and how they corresponded to objects found in Mary's home. The medical examiner, working within the scientific limitations of the era, described injury patterns in clear clinical terms. The wounds indicated blunt force trauma, delivered with notable strength and repetition. The shape and depth of certain injuries aligned with implements collected from Mary's kitchen. These objects were not inherently weapons, they were common domestic tools, but their dimensions and weight matched the characteristics of the blows observed on the body. The prosecution argued that such alignment, while not absolute proof, supported the broader narrative that the crime involved household items readily accessible in Mary's environment. Witness testimonies resumed, this time focusing on observations from the hours immediately before and after the crime. Residents who lived near Mary recalled hearing noises consistent with a struggle or with efforts to move heavy objects. Their testimonies varied in detail, influenced by distance and memory, yet they shared themes that supported the prosecution's timeline. That activity occurred indoors at an hour when Mary typically kept quiet, that sounds of scrubbing followed shortly afterward, and that the pram was moved with unusual haste. The prosecution acknowledged the limits of human recollection, but argued that the cumulative consistency of these testimonies created a pattern difficult to dismiss. As these details accumulated, the emotional dimension of the case resurfaced. Letters and accounts of interactions between Mary, Frank, and Phoebe were introduced once again, this time to contextualize motive rather than merely describe relationships. Though the letters contain no explicit threats or confessions, they illustrated emotional complexity and tension. The prosecution suggested that Mary's proximity to Frank, coupled with Phoebe's role as mother and partner, formed a motive rooted in jealousy and abandonment. Victorian courts placed significant weight on such emotional motives, viewing them as plausible catalysts for violent acts, especially where domestic relationships intersected with social instability. Throughout this phase, Mary maintained the same composed demeanor witnessed since the trial began. She showed no outward reaction to forensic descriptions, witness accounts, or contextual arguments. Observers noted that she listened attentively, at times lowering her gaze, but never displayed signs of distress. This silence continued to influence public interpretation. Some readers of the daily reports viewed her restraint as confirmation of calculated control. Others believed she withheld emotion as a means of endurance. In either case, her unwillingness to outwardly react allowed the evidence to dominate public perception, rather than her personal response to it. When the prosecution presented the final portions of its evidentiary case, they sought to unify the details into a single sequence of events. They argued that Phoebe visited Mary that day, that violence occurred inside the residence, that Mary transported the body with the pram, and that she attempted to erase physical traces afterward. They emphasized that while individual pieces of evidence might contain ambiguity, the combination formed a narrative with strong internal consistency. The murder, they suggested, was not spontaneous but emerged from escalating emotional tension and opportunity. Once the prosecution concluded, the defense rose to challenge the case. Their strategy did not rely on an alternative suspect or a rival narrative. Instead, they focused on dismantling the prosecution's interpretive structure. They argued that stains could not be definitively identified, that witness memories could be distorted by time or collective influence, and that household objects could bear marks from legitimate domestic labor rather than violence. The defense pointed out that no eyewitness observed the murder, no confession had been made, and no definitive scientific test proved that the blood-like stains were human. Their approach relied on creating space for reasonable doubt. The defense also attempted to recast Mary's demeanor as evidence of emotional restraint rather than guilt. They suggested that her calmness reflected her effort to maintain composure under extraordinary pressure, rather than an attempt to conceal wrongdoing. They emphasized her cooperation with police and her consistent statements asserting innocence. They argued that the prosecution's case relied on inference rather than certainty, and cautioned the jury against allowing public sentiment to guide judgment. These arguments did not erase the prosecution's case, but they highlighted uncertainty, reminding the court that circumstantial evidence required careful interpretation. The courtroom remained silent as each side articulated its position. Observers watched the jurors closely, searching their expressions for any indication of how they might weigh the evidence. As the defense concluded its presentation, the trial moved toward its final stage. The court prepared for closing arguments, the last opportunity for both sides to shape how jurors understood the evidence. The weight of the decision ahead settled heavily over the courtroom, where silence replaced the earlier bustle of testimony. And as Mary was escorted back to custody that evening, the path that had begun with investigation and passed through evidence now moved toward judgment. The verdict awaited, but before the court could reach its decision, final arguments were presented with measured deliberation. These closing addresses served not merely as summaries, but as interpretive lenses through which the jury was asked to view the evidence. The prosecution began by restating its central claim that the physical, circumstantial, and relational evidence formed a cohesive and convincing narrative pointing to Mary Pearcey as the perpetrator of the crime. They reviewed key elements methodically, not relying on emotional appeal, but on the structured progression of facts. They emphasized the alignment between the Pram's movement and the discovery site, the irregular cleaning patterns inside Mary's residence, the wounds corresponding to domestic tools, and the timing of noises heard by neighbors. They acknowledged that no single item proved guilt independently, but argued that the totality of evidence eliminated reasonable alternative explanations. In addressing motive, the prosecution spoke cautiously, recognizing the speculative nature of emotional interpretation. They noted that while letters contained no explicit threats, they indicated complex relationships among Mary, Frank, and Phoebe. They suggested that emotional strain, compounded by shifting loyalties and domestic instability, may have contributed to the violence. Victorian courts often accepted emotional motive as a legitimate component of legal reasoning, particularly in cases involving close personal relationships. Here, the prosecution framed jealousy not as the sole cause of the crime, but as a contributing factor that clarified intent. When the defense delivered its closing argument, the tone shifted. Their strategy continued to focus on reasonable doubt, emphasizing the limitations of 19th century forensic science. They questioned whether stains could be conclusively identified, whether objects could be definitively tied to injuries, and whether witness accounts might have been unconsciously influenced by news coverage and retrospective assumptions. They highlighted that no eyewitness observed the murder and no confession existed. The defense suggested that the prosecution's narrative was plausible, but plausibility alone did not satisfy the burden of proof required for conviction in a capital case. They argued that jurors must separate what seemed likely from what could be proven. The defense also returned to Mary's composed demeanor, urging jurors not to interpret restraint as evidence of guilt. They argued that her silence reflected the demeanor of a woman overwhelmed by accusation, not one comfortable in guilt. They asked the jury to imagine the difficulty of facing public scrutiny, confined within a courtroom where appearances could easily be misinterpreted. They concluded by reminding the jury that a conviction would result not merely in punishment, but in the irreversible finality of execution. After closing statements concluded, the judge delivered instructions to the jury. His role was not to determine guilt, but to guide jurors in evaluating evidence within the boundaries of law. He reviewed legal definitions relevant to the case, including the distinction between murder and lesser offenses. He explained that circumstantial evidence could form a sufficient foundation for conviction if it collectively established a conclusion beyond reasonable doubt. He urged jurors to deliberate carefully, free from external influence, and to base their decisions solely on evidence presented in court. The jury withdrew to deliberate in private. Their absence created a stark pause in the courtroom, where counsel, officials, and spectators waited in restrained stillness. Mary was escorted from the chamber while the jury considered its decision. Deliberations extended over hours, during which no updates emerged. Outside the courthouse, crowds assembled, filling the surrounding streets as the public anticipated the outcome. Newspapers prepared presses for immediate publication, editors waiting only for the verdict. When the jury eventually returned, the courtroom filled quickly and settled into silence. Mary was brought back to her seat, maintaining the same composed posture. Jurors filed into their places, their expressions unreadable. The judge asked whether they had reached a verdict, and they confirmed that they had. The foreman delivered the decision in clear, measured language. The jury found Mary Pearcey guilty of murder. The verdict produced a profound stillness before murmurs spread through the room. Some spectators felt relief at a conclusion they believed justified. Others experienced discomfort in witnessing a woman condemned under such severe charges. Mary remained still, receiving the verdict without visible reaction. Her restraint at this moment matched the composure she had shown throughout the trial, further shaping public perception of her character. Following the verdict, the judge proceeded to sentencing. In accordance with the law, a conviction for murder carried the penalty of execution. The judge pronounced the sentence with formal gravity, stating that Mary would be hanged. This moment marked the official determination of her fate, transforming the trial from a process of evaluation into a mandate for punishment. After sentencing, Mary was escorted from the courtroom. Observers reported that she walked with steady steps, neither slowed nor hastened by the weight of the verdict. She did not turn to address the crowd, nor did she display visible distress. She returned to custody, where she awaited the final stage of her sentence. Newspapers soon published detailed accounts of the verdict, repeating scenes from the courtroom and highlighting Mary's composure. Public response varied, but many expressed satisfaction that the case had reached closure, particularly given the brutality of the crime and the vulnerability of the victims. While awaiting execution, Mary's living conditions changed. Prison procedures for condemned prisoners were strict and solemn. She was housed separately, monitored closely, and granted limited access to visitors. Records suggest that she remained calm during this period, maintaining her reserved demeanor. She did not seek public attention or confess to the crime. She neither proclaimed innocence nor attempted to justify her actions. Her silence in the final days left questions that historians later debated, whether her composure reflected acceptance, resignation, or unspoken conviction. During this time, legal avenues for appeal existed but were not pursued with vigor. Public campaigns occasionally sought reprieve for condemned individuals, but such efforts did not arise prominently in Mary's case. Victorian society remained largely convinced of her guilt, and few questioned the verdict publicly. The severity of the crime, combined with the era's moral expectations, contributed to a general sentiment that justice had been served. As the date of execution neared, prison officials prepared with methodical adherence to procedure. Execution in this period was conducted privately, though reports were often widely circulated afterward. The process involved precise timing, official witnesses, and adherence to formal protocols designed to ensure order. On the night preceding her execution, Mary reportedly rested quietly. There are no records indicating that she made final statements of remorse or confession, leaving historians to interpret her silence in multiple ways. In the early morning hours, officials assembled in accordance with procedure. Mary was brought forward accompanied by officers and clerical authorities. Observers described her demeanor as composed and orderly. She proceeded without resistance, maintaining the same quiet presence that had characterized her throughout the investigation and trial. The execution was carried out according to legal mandate. With the sentence fulfilled, official records marked the case as closed, and Mary's remains were handled in accordance with regulations governing executed prisoners. Her death, though final, did not conclude public interest in the case. Instead, it shifted the story from courtroom scrutiny to historical reflection. The crime, trial, and execution left behind unanswered questions, enduring controversy, and a legacy that would persist in historical accounts for generations. But before history could fully reinterpret the case, Victorian society first reckoned with the immediate aftermath. The execution had passed. What followed was a long period of reflection on what the case revealed about crime, motive, and the complex role of women in a society defined by rigid expectations. The execution had passed, yet the end of Mary Pearcey's life marked only the beginning of a broader societal reckoning with what the case represented. Victorian England, a society deeply entrenched in moral codes and sharply defined expectations of female behavior, struggled to reconcile the reality of a woman executed for a crime marked by physical brutality and deliberate concealment. Public fascination persisted even after the sentence was carried out, fueled by lingering questions, unverified rumors, and the stark contrast between Mary's composed demeanor and the violent nature of the act. The discussion moved beyond courtroom facts and into the realm of cultural interpretation, where crime merged with social identity. The immediate aftermath of her execution was recorded in official documents with the sterile precision typical of prison records. These entries noted the fulfillment of the sentence, the presence of witnesses, and the compliance with required procedures. Such administrative summaries offered no insight into emotion or societal impact. They existed merely to confirm that legal obligations had been satisfied. The body of a condemned prisoner, once central to public discourse, became evidence of a completed process rather than a subject of further inquiry. Burial followed regulations of the time, with remains interred within prison grounds to prevent public spectacle or memorialization, reflecting the state's preference for quiet closure. Outside institutional walls, however, the public continued to discuss the case. Newspapers published retrospectives recounting the trial, highlighting moments that captured public imagination. The pram identified as a vehicle for the body, the quiet cleaning sounds heard by neighbors, the separation of mother and child on the night of the murder. Some articles portrayed Mary in stark moral terms, presenting her as a cautionary example of how emotional volatility could lead to unchecked violence. Others suggested that her crime reflected deeper psychological forces, even though Victorian society lacked the vocabulary to articulate such concepts with modern nuance. The discourse often relied on moral interpretation rather than psychological analysis, revealing the cultural constraints of the era. Among certain groups, speculation expanded beyond the immediate crime. Some amateur theorists suggested Mary might have been responsible for other unsolved acts of violence, particularly crimes involving women in domestic contexts. These claims lacked substantiating evidence and appeared to arise from a desire to connect her case to broader narratives of female criminality, rather than grounded investigation. Such rumors occasionally surfaced in public conversations and minor publications, though they held no official standing. They illustrate, however, the degree to which Mary's case lingered in the imagination of a society fascinated by deviations from expected norms. The legal community reflected on the case with measured analysis. Some officials viewed the conviction as a demonstration of the legal system's ability to hold individuals accountable, regardless of gender, affirming that the courts had relied on evidence rather than cultural bias. Others raised concerns about the reliance on circumstantial connections, questioning whether the absence of direct forensic confirmation might have warranted further caution. These critiques did not challenge the verdict directly, but they contributed to ongoing conversations about evidentiary standards in criminal trials, which would evolve significantly in the decades that followed. At the same time, the case prompted reflection on the limitations of Victorian forensic science. Investigators had relied on visual comparison of stains, texture analysis of fibers, and object correlations derived from physical impressions. Future advancements would allow for chemical blood identification, microscopic fiber matching, and forensic pathology with greater precision. In hindsight, the methods used in Mary's case appeared rudimentary, though they represented the best available tools of the era. The case became an example historians cited when examining the transition from observation-based investigation to laboratory-based forensic science, The broader social context also shaped how the case was remembered. Victorian England maintained rigid expectations regarding femininity, morality, and domestic roles. Women were often judged not solely by their actions, but by how their behavior aligned with cultural ideals of restraint, care, and emotional propriety. When women committed crimes that violated these expectations, public response intensified. Mary's case challenged cultural assumptions by presenting a woman accused of deliberate, physical violence rather than poisoning or crimes enacted through indirect means, which were more commonly associated with female offenders of the period. This contrast unsettled public perception and contributed to the enduring fascination with her story. Mary's composure throughout the investigation, trial, and execution continued to influence interpretations. Observers struggled to understand her silence. Some believed it indicated guilt concealed behind emotional control. Others suggested it reflected a complex internal state that remained inaccessible to outside observers. Without written confessions or personal accounts, historians have only recorded impressions to examine, leaving Mary's thoughts and motivations ultimately unknown. Her lack of emotional display became itself a subject of speculation, yet such interpretations reveal more about societal expectations of women than about Mary as an individual. In the years following the case, her story entered broader historical discussions about gender, crime, and social order. It appeared in criminology studies, memoirs of investigators, and retrospectives of Victorian legal history. Writers returned repeatedly to the central elements of the narrative: the triangle of relationships, the transformation of domestic space into a crime scene, and the unsettling calm of the accused. These elements became the focal points through which the case was retold, sometimes as cautionary narrative, sometimes as historical documentation. Over time, the case also became a lens through which historians examined attitudes toward women who lived outside traditional social structures. Mary's life, marked by independence, mobility, and relationships formed outside marriage, reflected the challenges faced by women who existed beyond conventional expectations. These circumstances did not explain or excuse the crime, but they contextualized the vulnerability and social isolation that often accompanied unconventional paths in the 19th century. As scholarship evolved, interpretations shifted from moral judgment toward careful analysis of structural pressures affecting women who lacked formal social and economic support. Despite scholarly reinterpretation, the case retained an air of unresolved mystery. The specifics of Mary's emotional state before and during the crime remain absent from historical record. No confessions, diaries, or final written reflections survive, if they ever existed at all. Thus, modern readers encounter the case through documents produced by the state, the press, and the court, leaving only inferred silhouettes of personal motive. The absence of first-hand insight creates a historical distance, allowing the case to be studied but preventing a definitive understanding of Mary's perspective. In the end, the case became less about a single act of violence and more about the social framework into which it was absorbed. It represented the intersection of emerging forensic science, gender expectations, public sensationalism, and legal authority. It showed how Victorian society responded when confronted with crime that challenged long-standing assumptions about human behavior. Yet even with these layers of interpretation, one final question lingered in the minds of those who continued to study the case. How would history remember a woman whose crime defied the norms of her time and whose silence left her intentions hidden? That question would carry forward into later decades, as historians continued to revisit the case from different perspectives. Over time, the story of Mary Pearcey evolved from an active crime investigation into a subject of historical analysis, shaped by the changing values and methodologies of each era that examined it. When contemporary reactions faded and the individuals involved passed from living memory, the case transitioned into a space where scholars, criminologists, and cultural historians could observe it with distance, seeking to understand not only what happened, but what it revealed about the society in which it occurred. With the passage of years, the emphasis moved away from sensational headlines and transitioned toward a deeper inquiry into context, motive, and the broader implications of how Victorian England administered justice. In later decades, researchers turned their attention to the limitations of the investigation itself. They noted that the forensic methods available at the time relied primarily on visual inspection rather than chemical analysis, meaning that crucial evidence such as blood, fibers, and physical residues could not be tested with scientific certainty. Although the patterns observed at Mary's residence aligned with the prosecution's narrative, future scholars questioned whether modern testing might have produced clearer conclusions or introduced alternative interpretations. They acknowledged that the case reached conviction under a legal system in transition, where traditional testimony remained dominant and scientific inquiry was only beginning to develop. Yet even with these limitations, many historians concluded that the convergence of evidence was substantial enough to meet the standards of the time, given the coherence of physical findings and behavioral patterns. Historians also examined the cultural environment in which the trial unfolded. Victorian society placed enormous importance on social identity, particularly in relation to gender and morality. Women who diverged from established expectations, whether through independence, non-marital relationships, or unconventional lifestyles, often faced additional scrutiny. Mary's life, marked by mobility, self-reliance, and emotional entanglements outside marriage, did not conform to the era's idealized image of femininity. Scholars considered whether these deviations influenced how the public perceived her, and whether her refusal to express remorse or vulnerability challenged societal expectations in ways that deepened condemnation. They emphasized that while official records do not indicate that her gender influenced the legal outcome directly, public discourse surrounding her trial frequently framed her actions as an affront to social norms rather than solely a breach of law. Criminologists studying patterns of female criminality found Mary's case particularly significant because it contrasted with common profiles of women's crimes during the 19th century. Many offenses involving women in this period were associated with poisoning, infanticide, property disputes, or indirect forms of harm, often linked to desperation or social vulnerability. Mary's case, involving physical violence, transportation of a body, and subsequent concealment, presented a different pattern, one characterized by direct force rather than passive or covert methods. This distinction influenced how later researchers classified the case, placing it among a smaller subset of crimes committed with overt physical aggression. It challenged assumptions about what forms of violence women were presumed capable of and demonstrated that historical patterns were shaped as much by circumstance as by societal expectation. Beyond criminology, social historians viewed the case through the lens of class dynamics. Mary lived within a working-class environment defined by instability, limited economic opportunity, and social fragmentation. Her relationships and movements unfolded in spaces where privacy was scarce, where neighbors observed daily routines, and where survival depended on employment and informal support networks. Scholars argued that such conditions contributed to emotional strain and social vulnerability. They were careful not to attribute the crime to poverty or circumstance alone, but they recognized that the pressures of urban life provided context for understanding relationships marked by dependency and tension. In this way, the case illuminated broader themes of urban isolation and the fragile nature of domestic stability in industrializing cities. As historical distance increased, interpretations continued to diversify. Some modern writers approached the case through psychological frameworks unavailable during Mary's lifetime, asking whether her actions, if committed as alleged, reflected emotional trauma, mental illness, or unresolved personal conflict. Because Mary left no confessional record, such interpretations remain speculative, offering possible explanations rather than definitive conclusions. Still, these analyses highlight how evolving cultural understandings of mental health reshape the way past events are interpreted. They remind readers that historical cases are not static, but continually re-examined as society's interpretive tools evolve. Despite these expanded perspectives, the lack of direct personal testimony from Mary continues to limit definitive understanding. She offered no written confession, no recorded explanation, and no reflections expressing guilt or innocence. Her silence preserves ambiguity, allowing multiple interpretations to coexist. Some view her composure as calculated, others as dignified, and still others as a coping mechanism forged through years of societal pressure. This ambiguity ensures that the case remains not only a record of crime and punishment, but also a site of unanswered questions that resist closure. The legacy of the case also extends into cultural memory. The location of the crime, the pram, and the domestic setting have become recurring symbols in retellings. They reflect how ordinary objects and familiar environments can intersect with acts of violence, disrupting the distinction between safe domesticity and private harm. The case also serves as a historical reminder that violence need not occur in distant or unfamiliar places. It can emerge quietly within the routines of everyday life, unobserved until consequences surface. With time, the individuals involved receded into history. Frank Hogg, whose relationships with Mary and Phoebe form the emotional foundation of the case, remained a figure of passing interest in later accounts, more context than focus. Phoebe, the victim, gradually received renewed attention as historians shifted from perpetrator-centered narratives to more balanced accounts that foreground victims' lives and identities. The child, whose survival carried both relief and sorrow, grew beyond the historical moment into private life, separate from the public narrative of the tragedy that marked infancy. These individuals, once surrounded by public scrutiny, returned to the quiet anonymity that time eventually grants. Ultimately, the case endures not because it provides clear answers, but because it reveals how complex lives intersect with law, society, and history. It demonstrates how evidence is interpreted through the lens of its time, how personal relationships can escalate into irreversible outcomes, and how silence can leave final interpretations unresolved. It invites reflection on how communities respond to tragedy and how judgment is rendered when certainty is elusive. Today, the story of Mary Pearcey stands not only as a record of crime, investigation, and punishment, but as a historical document shaped by the values, constraints, and assumptions of the society that produced it. It reminds us that the past is understood not simply through events themselves, but through the ways we interpret them across time. And as with many cases preserved in history's darker archives, what remains are not final answers, but enduring echoes.